to our third and last webinar on feedback and perception of learning. So just quickly revisiting what we've done. Like 2 weeks ago, we kind of covered the concepts involved in giving feedback, perception of learning, like a very general overview. Last week, we worked on planning feedback, preparing ourselves to give feedback. And today we are actually going to get a little more practical, and we're going to discuss giving feedback in the classroom, right? So we're going to start with revisiting features of effective feedback that we've seen already in the first week. And second, we're also going to briefly revisit the planning that we did last week. We're going to talk about monitoring, and then finally we're going to focus on 2 different moments of feedback, right? So feel free to make comments or ask questions as we go along, right? And of course, at the end, we will have a moment specifically for questions and so on. So let's start by reviewing what we're calling here the key features of effective feedback. It's important that they're very clear at this point, because I would like you to bear them in mind as we talk about this feedback given for this specific lesson, right? So effective feedback is, number 1, transparent, meaning learners know that it's taking place and they understand the purpose, right? Effective feedback is also specific. So what does that mean? It's concrete, it's contextualized, so students understand and accept the feedback. And also it leads to specific action. Effective feedback is also timely, well-timed, meaning it's given while the context, the goals, the performance is still fresh in the learner's minds. It happens every time there is need for it, there's an opportunity for it. And an important point to be made now is that learning feedback can be planned, but sometimes, many times, it's also unplanned, but it's always intentional. We don't give feedback by accident, right? We know what we're doing. Effective feedback is also ongoing and intertwined with teaching. So feedback is not that slot in the lesson. That slot is, of course, an opportunity for feedback, but feedback can happen anytime. If we think of learning and teaching as a continuum, we can see feedback as an opportunity to push students, help students move along this continuum. Feedback should also be goal-oriented. We many times have very clear goals. Well, we step into the classroom with clear goals, but are they clear to students? So we need clear goals, but we need clear feedback. These goals can be immediate or long-term goals. You know, it could range anywhere in between the two. And feedback informs learners of where they are in relation to these goals. Effective feedback is also careful and user-friendly. What does that mean? Well, feedback assesses and informs, but it does not test. Also, feedback shouldn't overwhelm learners, so we need to think carefully about the amount of feedback we're giving at certain points of the lesson, and what the appropriate amount would actually be, right, for those students at that point. Finally, effective feedback involves learners. So feedback is an opportunity for learners to assess and adjust their own performance, and also it leads to the development of learning strategies and of course, because of this, it leads to the development of autonomy. So to help us as we go along, I'm going to share this list with you in the chat box. And Valmir is saying also feedback means action for changes for both teachers and students. Oh yes, definitely. Because I think, Valmir, this is in a way related to like feedback being intertwined with instruction, isn't it? So it's very much part of our teaching, such a way that sometimes we're not even that conscious of the fact that we are giving feedback, right? So these are the keys. Remember, bear them in mind as we go along, right? And let's now move on to the planning. So I'm going to revisit the planning that we talked about last week. This is going to be quite brief, but it's important that you understand what was planned, so you understand the feedback that was given, right? So it's an 83 lesson 18. You might be teaching it this week, hopefully. So even though, I mean, we've been talking about feedback being ongoing, we're going to discuss two specific feedback moments of this lesson, right? So when we planned, basically, I used 4 guiding questions, which are, how will I collect information? We're talking about monitoring here. What will I give feedback on? How will I give this feedback? Who am I going to give feedback to, or even who's going to give the feedback? Because we have to consider that students can give feedback to each other, right? As long as they have the proper guidance, right? So these were the guiding questions for the planning. And of course, we're also, we were also taking into account the features of effective feedback, right? So the lesson is, as you can see here, the objective is sharing experiences with people from different backgrounds. So this is something that students would do in real life, they might do. Then you have the real life task, which is simply the objective contextualized. So we have an actual situation. You have been transferred to a new department or city. Describe how you felt when you arrived at the new department. Mention one thing you have never done before and one thing you have learned. Then you have the expected language, which is what this would look like, and a language item, which is very useful in this situation, which is the present perfect, right? So this is these are the objectives, let's say. This is what they look like. Then the lesson starts communicative consolidation. There's skills development, but for speaking initially, there's a video. They talk about different age groups, and they discuss what they think is the best time in a person's life. Then there's the lesson objective, and then we have another skills development. This time it's reading, right? So there's a pre-reading, which is related to the video again, and then they read a text about 2 pensioners who have unusual hobbies, right? So there's a reading for gist, reading for details, and there's a post-reading. So there is no feedback slot as such here. However, knowing my students and knowing how they struggle with reading, I decide that they will need feedback at this point. Okay, so how did I plan this? I asked myself the questions. How will I collect the information? What on? Of course, in this case, I thought, oh, okay, so strategies, reading strategies, right? How will I give feedback, and who will I give feedback to? Who's going to give feedback to whom, basically, right? So these were my guiding questions for the planning of this feedback. And also something else we talked about briefly last week was the impact this would have on their perception of learning. So, moving on. From that point, students go to holistic noticing of the present perfect. Then we have 3 practice moments, which you might choose to do and would change whatever, but this is what we have in the guidelines. There are feedback slots, as you can see. There are many opportunities for feedback at this point, but we are going to give feedback on a different moment of the lesson. However, something which is important to point out here is that we're going to start, of course, with controlled practice. And something that might help is to think that the more controlled the practice is, the more targeted your feedback will be. So if you are working, for example, you're drilling and you're working on very specific pronunciation features of the present perfect, ask yourself how useful it might be to give them feedback on other things, for example. So before moving on, remember, the more controlled the practice, the more targeted the feedback could be, right? So after this, we come to the real life task. So feedback, right? So I planned to give feedback here. Again, the questions. How will I collect information? I decided the way I would do that. What on? I decided on 3 things. I decided on pronunciation, specifically intonation. I decided I would give feedback on interaction, and finally on the present perfect. And at the same time, I'll try and keep my mind open for whatever else might happen. The third question, how will I give feedback? Who's going to give feedback to whom? So this is what these are the questions I asked myself as I was planning. Something else that I planned would be to connect the next step to the feedback. The next step would be showing the lesson objective. So basically, we're asking students to have a look at their own production and assess themselves and decide whether they think they have learned or not, right? And how much and why and so on. Another point that I would link to the feedback is the homework, because remember, effective feedback is specific, leading to specific action, right? So this was the planning. So we can move on to the actual feedback that was given. But first, I think we should take a few minutes to talk about monitoring. I don't know if you agree with me, but I feel that monitoring is quite challenging for most of us. So we have several questions, such as like, oh, what shall I listen out for? And when I'm listening to my students, sometimes I'm not able to select anything, or some students speak so quietly I can hear them. Should I stand up? Should I sit down, etc. So I thought of some useful questions that you could perhaps ask yourself, while you're planning, but also during the lesson. So, should I walk? Should I sit down? Where? If I'm standing up, will I be close to students? How close should I get to my students? How can I guarantee they will not interact with me? Well, I have to think of the distance, right? Shall I take notes? A lot of notes, fewer notes? How will I organize my notes? Should I organize them as I plan to board them? How can I listen out for specific aspects and yet keep an open mind, right? So these questions will come up again as we look at the feedback, how the monitoring was done and how the feedback was given, right? So if you have, do you have any questions, comments related to monitoring? Feel free to share. So, as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to give feedback on 2 specific moments of the lesson, right? Let's see, Valmir's typing a message. Let's see. No. So Valmir is saying, sometimes I feel that students get intimidated when I get close. Yes, for sure. They kind of freak out. Is it my beard? Well, maybe Valmir. Yeah, there's that, because there's that feeling of like, oh my goodness, the teacher is assessing me, the teacher's taking notes of my mistakes, right? But I think, Valmir, there's also the fact that if you and I are sitting and chatting and someone approaches us, we're going to include that person, even out of politeness, you know? So the distance here is important. And also, being quite transparent in like telling students that you will be listening to them and taking notes, you know, don't mind me, I'm just listening, kind of thing. And about learner training as well, isn't it? They get used to that. If you do that all the time, they know that when they're speaking, you'll be paying a lot of attention and taking notes. So it's something you can build up with your students. Yeah. I don't think it's your beard, by the way. All right. So feedback moment 1. So this was the reading, right? Skill development. So the monitoring was done. Oh, sorry, João wrote a message. Planning the feedback should be done while monitoring. But then when I stop monitoring, students tend to stop speaking. Do you mean, João, that when you you stop monitoring and you start writing on the board, they become silent? Is that what you mean? Yeah, okay. Yeah, it's kind of awkward sometimes, isn't it? I'm not sure the students feel it's awkward, but I do. The way I try to deal with it is I don't write everything at once. I write as I give feedback, you know? So I think that helps a bit, so you don't have those long, awkward silences, right? And again, just tell them to continue talking. You can say, okay, please continue talking and I'm gonna write a few things, and that's okay. So the monitoring for this part, so the students are reading, right? So students are observed from a distance. So I observed my students while they were reading, okay? From a distance, I'm sitting down, for example, and then more closely as they discussed answers, right? And finally, when you're checking with the whole group, you're checking the answers, you pay a lot of attention of the information they're giving you, right? So you can tell like if certain students had problems and so on. So the notes that I took, all right, I noticed 2 students were frowning as they read. Is that necessarily an indication of difficulties? I don't know. Another 3 students were reading with the finger. Again, is that a sign of difficulty? 5 students were highlighting words they didn't know. 3 students were highlighting evidence. And out of 18 students, 5 finished early. Okay, so this is the information I managed to gather as I observed them, right? And also when I interacted with them in checking the answers. So how was the feedback given? All right, so I started by asking students about their performance. So I asked them to, you know, like how did you do, etc. And because I had planned to talk about strategies before they read, then it made all the sense in the world to refer to these strategies. So did you use the strategies? Which one? Did they help? Yes, no. Of course, I would encourage them to discuss that amongst themselves before sharing with the group. Then I would share my observations, and then I would invite the students to help me with a list of tips that they could use the next time they do a reading, right? So this is what it looked like, right? So remember, this was done with the help of the students. So number 1, focus on the reading questions, not on the words you don't know. Number 2, fast or slowly? Fast for general, slowly for details. And number 3, remember, it works outside the classroom too. So I'm like organizing the ideas, my ideas, their ideas, and I ask them to copy because they need this for further reference. So copy in your notebooks. Valmir, I feel that written feedback comments are more effective than spoken feedback. What do you think? I think, Valmir, that writing makes things more specific. You have the visual support. So I agree. Sometimes we make very interesting feedback comments, but because we are just speaking and not really systematizing anything or boarding anything, this very interesting feedback may be lost to students, right? Another reason why I asked them to copy. An important consideration at this point is when we talk about perception of learning, we often think about like students say, okay, I have learned this, but it's important to consider that believing that you can learn is also perception of learning. So it's not only, okay, I have learned this or I haven't, but also I'm able to learn, I'm able to learn more. So this is where this kind of feedback comes in, because we're giving feedback on learning, not on language specifically, right? So an important point here. Valmir wrote, maybe because they can have more accurate memories of our feedback. Yes, definitely, Valmir, definitely. Yeah, they can, yeah, it's that kind of like memory you have where you know exactly where something is in a book, for example, right? Okay, so this was the feedback, the first feedback moment, okay? Moving on, feedback moment 2 was the real life task, speaking. So the monitoring was done like walking around unobtrusively, I mean, trying to be unobtrusive. Also, I informed students that I would be listening only at that point. So they kind of got the message, of course, you have to be available if they need you, if they need help, of course, but they know that your primary job at that moment is to listen and take notes. The notebook, well, the page was divided into 4 squares. One for pronunciation. I had planned to focus on intonation. Then we had a square for interaction. Then a square for the use of the present perfect, of course. And then a 4th square, which is blank, for anything that might come up. So I took notes as I listened, focusing and yet keeping an open mind. And in this, I was helped by having that blank square, right? You have to find like strategies, techniques for like helping you improve your listening skills, your observational skills. And I think the blank square is like something that works for me, right? So the first feedback I gave was something that I had forgotten about when I planned, right? I had planned to work on pronunciation, but focusing on intonation. But then what about the contracted forms? So I noticed they weren't using the contracted forms. And they sounded a bit strange and artificial. So I wrote down a sentence from one of the students. I've never cooked pasta. Then I asked them to read it out, and then I underlined, I asked them, so this sounds a bit artificial. How can you sound more natural? A couple of students came up with the contracted form. I wrote it down. This was followed by quick practice, some drilling, and then like the drilling in groups, just with like a substitution drill. for like, I don't know, 30 seconds, 40 seconds, and that was it. And then ask students to copy, right? Remember, they need this for further reference. Or even if they never look at this again, I'm sure writing will help them anyway, right? It will help fixate things. So then I moved on to the intonation. So I wrote this question that one of the students had asked, and I asked them to read this out, but showing interest. And then I helped them visually with an arrow. I focused only on the beginning of the question because less is more here. Let's focus on, a couple of things. Remember, feedback should not be overwhelming. And then again, ask them to practice asking each other questions. They like asking and answering, always focusing on showing interest, right? Again, copy, right? So that was pronunciation. Then I decided to move on to interaction, right? Because I've noticed that this group of students, they don't have many strategies, like when communication breaks down, they don't really know what to do. And even though this didn't happen much in the lesson, I thought, okay, this is a good opportunity to give feedback on this anyway, because it's something that I always notice. So I started by asking them, what do you do when you have a problem, you don't understand what the person is saying, so there's a problem in communication? They shared some of their repair strategies, and I gave them another one. I added to the list. So we had, sorry, I don't understand. Can you repeat that? And I also told them not to say what, because it's rather rude. So then we practiced with intonation, of course, sounding polite and so on, drilling, again, copying and moving on, right? So finally, I followed my planning and gave them feedback on the present perfect. So I started by writing these two sentences, which different students had produced. I told them they were correct, and I asked them why. But when I asked them why, I asked them to refer to the notes they had made during the noticing, or to open their books, refer to the grammar box in the books, right? So great. Then I wrote down two sentences that were incorrect, and I asked them to work in pairs trying to correct them. Again, they could consult their notes, the book, and so on. So they helped me correct these sentences. And then to give them some practice and reinforce what they have just seen, I erased some things, I left the frames and asked them to practice. So they had to complete these sentences in different ways, right? And again, asking them to copy so they could come back to that at some point, right? And you will see that each feedback slot, let's say, ends with a little bit of practice, right? Because remember, effective feedback, it has to lead to specific action. Vamos say a more meaningful moment for them, yes, for sure, because then they can say something, they can produce something with like with this language, but something which is about them or about things that are relevant to them. That's right. Or even if they're inventing things, I mean, that's super meaningful as well, because you're being creative, so no problems there, right? And then remember the blank square? Well, something really nice happened as I was listening, because I noticed the students were responding or trying to respond to each other by using an expression, a chunk that they had seen in a dialogue from the flip chart, which is, sounds fantastic. So I thought that was very positive, because I think especially at this level, they need to work on sounding more natural, communicating more naturally. So I obviously gave feedback to them on this. So I wrote, sounds fantastic. And I asked them to work together in pairs or trios and come up with 4 other words that could replace fantastic, and the words had to be positive. So this is what they came up with: great, awesome, good, brilliant. And then, of course, followed by quick drilling. So they would say this with feeling, right? And again, copying, right? So, and this ended this, the feedback on the real life task. So what you can see is that we start with students' production. They have the chance to look at their production, assess, adjust. With my input as well, my observations, they can make further adjustments. And there's always some kind of very quick practice to consolidate what we have just seen. So it's not this is right, this is wrong. No, we need to go a little beyond that. Remember, like, it leads to action, right? Think of the impact that this has on a learner's perception of progress, right? And speaking of which, the next step would be to go back to the lesson objective, right? So think of what you can do when you have just given feedback and you go back to this. Think of linking these 2 things. You can be very transparent about the teaching and the learning and ask students, so how did this feedback help you here? Did it help you? Do you think you're better able to do this? And all kinds of questions to involve learners in having a self-assessment moment, right? And again, as mentioned earlier, the homework fits in very nicely here. And I even circled here exercise 2, because I said to my students, so this exercise specifically will help you with what we worked on just now, etc. So remember, again, leading to concrete action, right? So if we go back to our list of the features of effective feedback, I would like you to take take a moment to assess, to consider whether these 2 feedback moments were effective. So So, do you have any questions, comments, any ideas that regarding feedback that you would like to share? Hi, Dina. I hadn't seen you. You had joined us. So while people are typing, I'm going to take the opportunity to thank Renato, who is with us, who helped me with the board, with his lovely handwriting, and also with his ideas. So the board, the pictures of the screenshots of the board that you saw are not actually my handwriting, but Renato's, right? Thanks, Renato. So Vami says, a well-planned feedback makes it more memorable for learners. It enhances more commitment. I agree, Vami. Yeah, definitely. But don't forget to include in your planning, to include being open to whatever might happen, you know? So I don't know how many people taking part in this webinar are musicians or playing musical instruments, but you know, like jazz musicians, mainly like experts at improvisation, right? And musicians these musicians always say that you can only improvise if you're well prepared. So what I'm saying is you prepare yourself to give feedback, but part of this preparation is actually like reminding yourself that you will have to keep an open mind, right? Yes, Valmi says flexibility is the key, definitely. Because remember, the greatest material you have is what your students are giving you, like their production, their learning, yeah? João, after CA1, should we give some sort of feedback, discuss strategies, maybe? Yeah, João, I think so. I think CA1 is, after CA1, it's an important moment for students to like do some self-assessment and so on. Talk about the strategies, but remember, we should be talking about learning strategies also before doing things, not only after that, right? I think the feedback after CA1 has to be especially careful and friendly, because you don't want people feeling that, oh my goodness, I got 13 in the test, I'm a failure, right? Whereas, you know, we know that I had this yesterday, for example, a student said that, and 13, my PT test was great. She did really well, but anyway. Give like specific feedback, both of areas for improvement, but also strong points, yeah? And be specific when you're giving positive feedback. Don't be specific only when you're giving negative feedback, right? I think these are some important points here, right? Okay. So to wrap up, I will share with you some interesting reading. This is all very easy to find on the internet. I strongly recommend The Power of Feedback by Hattie and Timperley. Very interesting reading. And it's research-based, very, very clear, very kind of like reader-friendly, okay? And if you want to get in touch, if you have any comments, questions, feel free. This is my email. Thank you so much for attending the webinar. Thank you for your contributions, and good luck with your feedback, right?